The iron Chrysler 392 Hemi was built for 2 years, 1957 and 1958. That's it. And by the end of the 1960s, the entire sport of top fuel drag racing was running on whatever was left of them. Think about that for a second. The premier class of American drag racing, the fastest accelerating machines on the planet, and their engine supply was a finite pile of junkyard iron that got smaller every single weekend. Nitromethane doesn't burn in a combustion chamber, it detonates. And that detonation was cracking those old blocks around the crankcase faster than anyone could dig up replacements. The engine that powered the sport was going extinct, and nobody at Chrysler was making more. One man saw it coming, he built the answer, and then he watched somebody else get the credit for the rest of his life. His name was Ed Donovan, and they called him the Mole. His other nickname was Packy, short for Pachyderm, courtesy of Tom McEwen. Born in Los Angeles in 1928, obsessed with engines from childhood. He did a tour in the Army, he spent time in Alaska maintaining steam engines for the government, and came home to LA where he took a machinist job at Meyer & Drake on Gage Avenue. If that name doesn't ring a bell, the product will. Meyer & Drake built the Offenhauser, the engine that owned Indianapolis for decades. Donovan's mentors there were Ed Winfield, the legendary cam and carburetor man, and Leo Goosen, the design genius behind the Miller & Offenhauser engines. So before Ed Donovan ever touched a drag racing part, he'd been trained by the men who built the winningest race engines in American history. And he was a drag racer himself. He and a buddy ran a hopped-up Model B Ford Roadster at Santa Ana in the early 50s. Not a cautious one either. Hot Rod magazine credited Donovan as the first man to run the can, meaning nitro, in that B model. And he was clever about it. He filled the float bowls of his reworked Riley carburetors with alcohol, so the engine lit on alky before the nitro kicked in and never hydraulicked. Walk through a top fuel pit today and that's still how they start the cars. Donovan was doing it in the early 50s. At night, he'd go home and make stainless steel valves by hand. Valves that could survive nitro. He sold them to fuel racers who were destroying factory parts every weekend, and the side business grew until it swallowed the day job. By 1962, he and partner Frank's startup had opened Donovan Engineering in Inglewood, California. The catalog tells you everything about how this man's brain worked. The first 2-disc slipper clutch, developed with Goosen, titanium valves, forged rocker arms, the one-piece bell housings racers called clutch cans, built to keep an exploding clutch from cutting a driver in half. Donovan wasn't building trophies, he was building the parts that kept fuel racers alive. He was also, by every account, impossible not to like. The guy who always grabbed the dinner check, who'd give his employees the shirt off his back, who claimed to hate the name Joe and would cite examples like Paisano, Hrudka, Mondello, Tojo. A machinist with a wine collection and opinions about everybody. Even the Mole nickname was affectionate. His partner Frank's startup's brother reckoned Ed looked like a comic strip character, hunched over a car in his small dark garage, and the name stuck for life. In 1964, Donovan built a dragster called the Donovan Engineering Special and hired a young Californian named Tom McEwen to drive it. That year, McEwen went up against Don Prudhomme and the Greer Black Prudhomme car at Lions Drag Strip and beat the most feared operation in Top Fuel 2 straight rounds. And Donovan, who had a literary streak, reached for Rudyard Kipling, Rikki Tikki Tavi, the mongoose, the one animal that kills snakes. He hung the name on McEwen, and depending on who's telling the story, it was either coined as bait to lure Prudhomme into that match race, or as a celebration after beating him. Either way, everyone agrees where the name came from, Ed Donovan. That nickname became the other half of Snake and Mongoose. It led to the Mattel Hot Wheels deal in 1970, and one of the most valuable rivalries in motorsport history. If you had those cars on your bedroom floor as a kid, part of that came from Ed Donovan. Now hold on to one more detail from that day at Lions. The black in Greer Black Prudhomme was Keith Black. The engine McEwen beat was a Keith Black engine. Remember that because it'll matter later. In our last video, we told the story of Phil and Chris McGee, the Australians who built a quad-cam engine that showed real promise as an alternative to the Hemi, and how NHRA legislated it out of existence before it got a chance to prove itself. And the question a lot of you asked in the comments was a fair one. Why is the Hemi the only engine in top fuel? How did one engine become the law? Well, the answer starts in Ed Donovan's shop. Because Donovan believes something that sounds strange today. He believed the best engine for nitro racing wasn't the new 426 Hemi, it was the old one. The 392 was designed as a Hemi from the ground up, where the 426 was hemispherical heads grafted onto a wedge block. The 392 was simpler to tune on nitro, it needed far less ignition lead, and the racers of the era considered it damn near indestructible. Magazines from that time claimed that the 392s had been pulled out of junkyards, bolted into diggers with stock internals and run over 200 miles an hour. Now, whether every one of those stories is true, the belief was universal. Fuel racers trusted the 392 like they trusted gravity, and it was disappearing. So Donovan decided to build it again, better, in aluminum. The design brief had three requirements: strong enough to live on nitro, light and simple to service, and cheap enough that a working racer could actually afford one. That last part mattered to Donovan, so the 417 was designed to swallow the 392's own crank, cam, push rods and heads. Your existing pile of good parts still worked. The design work ran through 1969 and 1970, and here's a detail that almost never gets mentioned. It was a team effort. Donovan conceived it and drove it, but the drawings came from his chief engineer Bob Mullen, a former Chrysler engineer. Dick Crawford handled the tooling. Arnold Berner carved the casting patterns by hand. The result was the Donovan 417, an all-aluminum 392 strengthened everywhere the iron original broke, with one feature that changed life on the road for every touring fuel racer: wet replaceable cylinder sleeves. Smoke a piston and score a cylinder wall on a Saturday night? You didn't need to find a machine shop in, as one magazine put it, West Nowhere, Pennsylvania. You pulled the sleeve, dropped in a fresh one, and you raced on Sunday. And because the cylinders were sleeves, the block itself had no cylinder walls to crack. Damage the aluminum and you welded it and kept going, instead of brooming the whole engine. A magazine at the time compared the 417 to the Offenhauser and wrote that drag racing had finally joined the elite club of sports with an engine built purely for the racetrack. It was dubbed the first true aftermarket drag racing engine. Before Donovan, fuel racers ran modified junkyard iron. After Donovan, the sport had its own purpose-built power plant. Engine number 001 went to Kansas John Wiebe. And let's be clear about who Wiebe was, because he sometimes gets painted as a hobby racer from the sticks. The man from Newton, Kansas was a three-time AHRA Top Fuel World Champion who raced professionally for 12 seasons. Pretty serious operator. But in one way, he was old school. In 1971, with Don Garlits having just proven the rear engine car at the Winter Nationals after losing part of his right foot in that transmission explosion at Lyons, Wiebe was still running a front engine slingshot. He loaded the brand new Donovan into that slingshot and hauled it to Ontario Motor Speedway for the 1971 NHRA Supernationals. The engine was so fresh that Donovan himself flipped the starter switch for its first warm-up. And then Kansas John went out and qualified number 1. Low ET of the entire meet, a 653, an Ontario strip record with an engine nobody had ever seen before. He went rounds all the way to the final against gentleman Hank Johnson. And then came the burn down, a long drawn out staging duel, heat soaking into that brand new engine, and when the tree came down, Wiebe smoked the tyres. Johnson took it with a 661, the quicker car lost. And that race, as it turns out, was the last final round ever contested between two front engine top fuelers at an NHRA national event. The 417 didn't need long to prove the loss was a fluke. By 1972, it was all over top fuel. In England, Dennis Priddle bought engine number 144 and in April of 1975 ran 604 at 218 miles an hour, a world record for a front-engine dragster that stood into the 1990s. Nobody who ran a Donovan questioned the engineering. Keith Black asked a different question. Why copy the old engine when you could copy the new one? You know the name. Black built raceboat engines in Southgate, California, and the marine world taught him how to make horsepower survive sustained, brutal load. He came into drag racing through the Greer-Black Prudhomme partnership. Tommy Greer's money, Black's engines, Prudhomme's right foot, and a win rate the sport had never seen. That's the same Keith Black whose engine got beaten by Ed Donovan's car at Lyons in 1964, the day the Mongoose got his name. These two men had history, and Donovan won the first round. The second round went differently. By 1971, Chrysler announced its stockpile of Iron 426 race blocks was gone and the tooling was lost. Donovan had already proven an aluminum Hemi could survive nitro, and he wasn't alone for long. Millerton built an aluminum block of their own. The concept was proven, the market was real, and Keith Black wanted in. Chrysler wouldn't fund his block, but they gave him something arguably more valuable: engineering support. A former Chrysler engineer, Bob Mullen, had drawn the Donovan 417. Now, a Chrysler contracted engineer named Bob Tarozzi, fresh off Chrysler's own aluminum Hemi head program, got the call from Black's shop. Could he design an aluminum block? His answer, in his own words, hell yeah, we can do that. Tarozzi designed the KB aluminum block around the 426. Bigger architecture, wider bore spacing, more room to grow. It hit the market in 1974, 3 years behind Donovan, and it took over fast. Donovan made one last play for the top. In 1977, he convinced the biggest name in the sport, Don Garlits, to walk away from the 426 and run the 417. Garlits called it an engine deal I couldn't refuse, and according to Phil Burgess at NHRA.com, the deal was free parts at a time when Garlits was spending around $60,000 a year with Keith Black. Garlits ran the Donovan through 1978, set low ET at the Winter Nationals, won the Gator Nationals on Donovan power, and then went back to Keith Black for 1979. His verdict, in his own words, the Donovan was just not strong enough for the horsepower being produced. That sentence decided the engine war. The old 392 architecture that Donovan loved had its bore centers too close together. It simply couldn't grow with the power. The 426-based Keith Black could, and the sport voted with its checkbook. Between 1975 and 1984, every single NHRA national record in top fuel and funny car belonged to a Keith Black engine. Prudhomme ran KB. Shirley Muldowney won 3 championships on KB power. Amato, Bernstein, Force. Keith Black became the most famous non-driver in drag racing, and when he died of cancer in 1991, 2 years after Donovan, the industry mourned a titan. When Ed Donovan died in 1989, the industry mourned a friend. There's a difference. And here's the part nobody connects back to Donovan. Before he solved the supply crisis, the Chrysler Hemi was dying of natural causes. The 392 was long gone. The 426 line ended in 1971. If nobody had built an aftermarket block, fuel racers would have been forced to look elsewhere. The Ford Cammer gets an opening. The Boss 429 gets a reason to exist. The McGee quad cam arrives in a world where the Hemi is running out. Instead, Donovan proved the aluminum Hemi worked. Keith Black made the supply infinite, and NHRA never had a reason to accommodate anything else. The rulebook eventually capped bore spacing at 4.84 inches. The Hemi sits comfortably inside that at 4.80. The Boss 429 at 4.9 doesn't. The Cadillac at 5 inches, out. The GM DRCE at 4.9, out. And if you think that's ancient history, in 2004, Pat Austin and his father Walt announced they were modernizing the Boss 429 for top alcohol funny car. Word got out, and NHRA tightened the bore spacing rule from 4.9 to 4.84, effective the following season. The program died before the car ever ran. Walt Austin told the newspapers, "We were going to upgrade it with the latest technology, state-of-the-art stuff." Then they came out with this big deal saying the specs have changed. Ed Donovan intended none of that. He was solving the problem in front of him. His friends and customers were running out of engines. But the downstream consequence is that the Hemi became permanent, and every alternative engine since has been fighting an architecture that will never run out of blocks again. The The 417 wasn't his only act either. His aluminum small block Chevy became a staple of sprint car racing and even ran the Indianapolis 500 in Dan Gurney's stock block program. He copied the big block Chevy too, but the money never followed the genius. Hot Rod ran his obituary in September 1989, and the same painful detail echoes through every account of his life. Ed Donovan made almost no money on his developments, and the obituary explains why. He gave it away, free parts to his racers, free research and design work, because he was more interested in seeing his boys go fast than in getting paid. Darrell Buell, one of the Donovan gang, remembered him as the greatest host he ever knew, a man who never once let anyone else reach for the check. Under the crusty exterior, Buell said, was a polished, self-taught intellectual. The man played music in that shop by the hour, and it rubbed off. His son Eddie graduated from USC as a music major. His widow Kathy took over the company and kept it alive. Donovan Engineering still operates today in Torrance, California, and they still make the 417 blocks in both cast and billet, still winning in nostalgia drag racing 55 years after engine number 001 nearly won the Supernationals straight off the milling machine. The block outlived its maker by 37 years and counting. Ed Donovan was inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2003, 14 years too late for him to hear it. He named the Mongoose. He trained under the men who built the Offenhauser. He built the first true aftermarket drag racing engine. He beat Keith Black in 1964 and lost to him for the rest of his life. And by saving the Hemi from extinction, he locked it in forever. If you knew him, if you ran one of his engines, if you were at Ontario in 71, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, because stories like this one get better when the people who were there fill in the gaps. I'm Dan from Nitro Mouth. Like and subscribe for more stories like this, and I'll see you in the next one.